Be sure to subscribe for your chance to win a custom leather playmat when we hit 2,500 subscribers. Hey everyone, going to continue to nerd out on some concepts regarding economics and magic. It is one of my favorite parts of the game is that it's actually in a market. You're playing, trading, collecting, it's all tied together. And it's one of the reasons why I really can't get into things like spending money on Hearthstone or even the digital versions of Magic, like Magic Arena. I just think it's a sucker play. Like, I really don't get it. I feel like spending money on Arena is just a complete disaster. And, you know, most people, if they're playing Arena on their laptop and you come by and you ask them if they want to play some paper Magic, they couldn't get off the laptop fast enough. I mean, it's just not as good an experience. So that said, we're just going to kind of delve into the concept of inflation, what it means, how it relates to Magic the Gathering, and just what it can do to help you understand the financial side of Magic and what it means to be buying Magic cards or investing in Magic cards. So first off, inflation has a few different ways of defining it. I side with the Austrian school, which would talk about an increase in the money supply without a corresponding increase in the goods and services. So in theory, the amount of money is basically there to be a store of wealth for the economy. It's kind of a way of accounting for excess goods and services and able to kind of store that value for investment and for use later on. And you can, depending on how your money works, just make more money. And that's what happens when you have government money or bank-run money like we have in the United States. We have a Federal Reserve, which is a private bank, which is tied in pretty closely in some ways to the government. Like the head of the Federal Reserve is chosen by the government. But at the end of the day, it's a private institution. They make the money. And the reason for that is because if the government just had free reign to make as much money as it could, it would completely just print all the free money and it would just destroy everything, which we've seen. We've had that happen countless times across the world. And even in the US, we had an experiment with that, which doesn't go well. So we do have a Federal Reserve. Getting into personal perspective here, I'm actually not in favor of a centralized bank. I'd rather just have a market system for money. But this is what we have, and it does give us some data that we can study. So when you take a look at the value of the purchasing power of the dollar over time, since the inception of the Federal Reserve, I mean, it is pretty severe decrease. These Federal Reserve notes, they just keep making more of them, and you're going to see that the purchasing power of a dollar goes down. When you think about a loaf of bread used to be a nickel and now it's like $5. Well, if you had put, say, $1,000 aside back in the day to hand down to your kids, well, that would be a disaster. Or your grandkids, you know, like 50, 100 years later, you get like no return on that. It's just a complete mess. So that is what inflation ends up doing, is just robbing the value of the people that actually have the dollars. So as you print more dollars, the same amount of goods and services are being represented by those dollars. So if you double the money supply, and it's not exact correlation, but that's the pressure that it puts on the pricing. And the important concept that I want to get to here is inflation takes time. And it ends up being a transfer of wealth from the people that have already the dollars. And that transfer, when it's dollars, what ends up happening is the people that first get access to those new dollars, they are essentially taking out a loan or getting money direct from the banks and able to use that money to purchase assets. And then once inflation takes place and the new value of the dollar is established, you borrow $1 billion, you buy $1 billion worth of stuff. When inflation drives the prices up, now the thing that you bought for $1 billion is worth $2 billion. You can pay back your loan and you cleared $1 billion. Meanwhile, the people that had saved, $10,000 and they're working and trying to come up with a down payment for a house or whatever, all of a sudden their $10,000 that they had saved is now only worth $5,000 in purchasing power. So that's essentially a transfer of wealth that happens due to inflation. And we actually see that in Magic the Gathering as well, which is pretty much the reason I wanted to do this video, aside from touching on some of these nerdy economic concepts, is when Wizards of the Coast prints cards, the reprints, it's essentially a transfer of wealth to Wizards of the Coast is one way of thinking about it. So we've got players, for example, when we're talking about, what's a good example? Fetch lands. Let's say that a fetch land's $100, and then they go ahead and print Khans of Tarkir, and all of a sudden, fetch lands come down in half. Well, during that process, Wizards of the Coast is selling tons and tons and tons of booster packs, and they are profiting massively off of this, which is fine. And, this system is what it is. I'm not actually being super critical of it because this is what we're signing up for, and we understand that when there's no reserve list, like you're gonna be in these situations. So everybody, eyes wide open. This is part of the system. It's a good idea to understand it, which is what I'm trying to outline here for the best of my abilities. But that transfer of wealth is something to be mindful of. If the players are the ones that own all of the cards, when those cards go up in value due to increased demand because of a larger player base, it is the players who financially benefit from that. So if you see cards go from, a Soul Ring go from $1 to $5, okay, all the people that have Soul Rings made some money and or increased some value. And maybe that's just keeping up with inflation. Maybe it's doing better. I mean, that's neither here nor there. But overall, I think it's best that we have a system in place in Magic which at least keeps up with inflation. So you're going to see the value of the dollar continue to erode. They're just going to keep making more of them. That's really the only way that they can keep this whole thing afloat. It's a disaster. I could go on and on about that for a really long time, but bottom line is we've got this system in place. There are competing currencies, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, those type of things, but at the end of the day, the dollar is what we're actually transacting in for the most part, and that is going to continue to decrease in purchasing power over time as they make more and more and they inflate the monetary system, or the monetary supply. And the alternative would be something that doesn't keep up with inflation. So if you have something that's flat or goes down in value, I actually think that's the worst thing for Magic. A lot of people right now, you hear a lot of voices talking about reprints and accessibility and all these different things. You know what makes a card game not super accessible? It's when it's dead. And that's what's happened to most card games. So it's really important that Wizards keeps Magic going, keeps it profitable, keeps printing new sets, keeps doing these amazing things, because most of what they're doing is fantastic. There are some things like the Walking Dead that I did a video about, and it's amazing that they pissed off everybody with that. They pissed off people on the left who were concerned about people not getting the cards. They're just they're going to be too expensive, they're going to be too difficult to get. People on the right are pissed off because they're destroying the structure of Magic and the hierarchy and the system that got us to where we are. On a visceral level, they actually pissed off both sides for very different reasons, which is pretty impressive. But for the most part, Magic's doing a pretty good job, I think, and growing the player base and having a banner year. And I think that's what we actually need out of the game, is for them to continue doing a great job. And we want to see the value of cards at least keep up with inflation. So as inflation decreases the value of the dollar, if you spend $1,000 on Magic cards, the best case scenario is that it's worth at least $1,000 in the future, at least. And then as it continues to go up, that's even better. When it's at the point where the dollar doesn't buy as much as it used to, ideally you can trade, that same amount of Magic cards for the same amount of some other good or service where it kind of keeps up with that inflation. So that's just some of the core ideas here. Another way to kind of delve into this is to take a look at the actual way that inflation works with Magic bulk, which is probably the way that Magic is the closest to money. So bulk Magic, I did another video, is pretty, it's a type of money. It's not a very great money, but it is passable as money in the same way that cigarettes in prison are passable as money. They have all of the characteristics. They don't hit it out of the park, but it makes do. And you can definitely trade bulk into vendors and vice versa. There's a market for it, and it's pretty close. It's not perfect, but it is a type of money. And what we've seen is a constant increase in the supply. So for anybody that's skeptical of this type of definition of inflation, there are different schools of economic thought that I strongly disagree with. But from the Austrian perspective here, when we're talking about inflation, we're talking about the increase in the money supply, which decreases the purchasing power. And that's what we see with bulk commons and uncommons. I used to buy bulk commons. I mean, what was it, like $8 1,000 or something? And it's a fraction of that now. I think I'm buying it like $1.50 1,000. Like it's brutal. Like it is absolutely bulk commons and uncommons eventually may just not even be worth holding on to. That is totally possible. Like at this point, it's basically just the labor with the bulk commons and uncommons that makes it worth getting it all as a store. So it may just get to the point where the only people that are buying bulk are the people that have the ability to effectively and efficiently sift through it, find the cards that are actually worth dealing with, and maybe having some type of secondary purpose for the rest of it. Like I've started making buttons out of some different Magic card products right now. The booster pack wrappers come out awesome. The Magic cards themselves, not so much, but maybe I figure out a button press that can use the Magic card art, and then that kind of unlocks some potential, though commons and uncommons might not be the most exciting thing for people to have pictures of. There is some pretty sweet art. Maybe there's something there that could somehow generate some more value. But we've seen this downward trend in the value of bulk commons and uncommons. Bulk rares are the same way. When I first started buying bulk rares from people, I would actually trade for them at 15 cents per bulk rare, and then I would trade them to vendors. The highest vendor at the time was taking them in at 18 cents. So I was making a 20% margin, and my goal was just to get out there every time and trade as much as possible. If I could trade $200, $300, $400 worth of cards during an evening, I was making, $20, $40, $60, $80 in an evening of playing Magic, which was just fantastic. So that is another place where we've seen a slide. Now bulk rares are pretty much nickel rares in most places. The idea of paying 10 cents for a rare is long, long gone. And that was a low ball figure back in the day. Only 10 cents for a rare was pretty low. So that's the same thing. We've seen an increase in the supply, and they're inflationary models, and I knew that going into it. And that's part of the reason why I always turned over bulk so quickly, is because of that continual decrease in value over time. It was not something that just happened suddenly. You'd see it'd be like, oh wow, nobody's paying more than 9 cents anymore. It's like, okay, now it's only 8 cents per bulk rare. And there's just a decline as that supply just continues to get more and more. Now, are there exceptions? Are there different ways of slicing this data? Sure. If we talk about alpha rares, well, those are no longer bulk. Obviously, those are still worth a ton. If you start to subsection off, for example, things from Scars of Mirrodin and back, or from Tempest and back, or prior to Exodus, I guess it would be Stronghold. There are definitely ways that you could kind of structure bulk, but at that point, it's not really bulk, because the whole point of bulk is you don't have to filter it. It's just like total just garbage. It's like, this is just a box of rares. I don't even know what's in it. It's just rares. So there are things you can do to put in some extra effort, which can get you a higher rate. And those are probably going to go up over time because those supplies are not getting inflated. So if we're talking about Exodus and back for rares, or certainly things like alpha or beta or revised, different subsections of bulk could do better over time, because even though they might properly be lumped together as a component of bulk rares, the fact that they'd be worth pulling out of that will kind of differentiate. So those are just some general thoughts about inflation, how it relates to Magic the Gathering. And I suppose the last one, I keep trying to wrap this up and other stuff comes to mind. When we're talking about expectations and setting prices, keep in mind that inflation is a pressure. Like, it is not a type of thing that you just add or subtract and you're done. It's a big equation. It can't really be modeled accurately. I'm not a big fan of economic models. I think they're largely nonsense. And you have to be, like you can be really, really, really wrong if you're really smart and rely on models. Like you can be so far off we've seen that a little bit with some of these COVID forecasts where you have just like world leading scientists that have models with some incorrect assumptions in them. And then it's just like you're off by a factor of 10 or 100. And like the same thing happens in economics where you've got underlying assumptions. So I'm not a big fan of models. I am a big fan of trying to understand the forces as best you can, recognize that you can't predict with accuracy, but just kind of get a general trend of what's happening. So what I would say about inflation is it pushes the prices of the cards down. Like just in general, the inflation of the card supply pushes the value of those cards down. I'm talking about an increase in the amount of those cards. Now, it can be a specific card, like say Force of Will, where if they print more Force of Wills, the printing of more forces actually pushes down on the price. But that's not the only thing going on there. So when they do print new Force of Wills, that also on occasion can also help be part of stimulating new demand by being part of an exciting new release, something that brings people back into the pool. If you have players that are no longer active and they see something like Double Masters, maybe they actually come back in and become part of the equation as they now add to the demand for those cards. And of course, the rising demand puts pressure upwards on the price. So a reprint we've seen in Pokemon before where they'll reprint stuff from like the early days, and that actually brings those people back in. And because it's a new card, that increase in demand, just kind of raises all the ships. The rising tide raises all ships in that regard. So when you're trying to conceptualize what's going to happen with pricing, I personally think it's best I found it to be the most successful, I guess I should say, is to try and conceptualize it in terms of forces, where you've got an increase in the supply kind of pushing down on the value of the cards. And then you also have to gauge the increase in demand based off of new players joining, things like the pandemic where maybe people are playing from home more, they're playing webcams, whatever it is. You got to kind of factor that in if you're going to have a good understanding. It's not ever going to be just like a single variable. And, one thing I think I've talked about before is expectations are a big part of that. That's another pressure that gets put on the card. So one of the things that keeps prices down is the expectation of reprints. So something like Force of Will, as time goes on and people think, Force of Will is probably due, or it gets leaked from Wizards where people hear that there's a Force of Will coming, that starts to put pressure downward on the prices. It's not the only factor, but it is part of the equation. You've got, the inflation, you've got the fact that this card could get reprinted, you've got new players coming in, you've got people leaving, you've got people outraged about The Walking Dead, you've got people that are outraged about Wizards of the Coast's perhaps virtue signaling. They might argue that, they're pretending like they're concerned about social issues, but then they don't do anything about, the unbelievably horrific things going on in China with the Uyghur population. It's like, here's a thing you could actually impact instead of, cards that you don't even sell anymore. Like, are you actually concerned about like the real world, or is this just a free exercise in marketing publicity? Those are type of things that affect people. Like a lot of people leave the game over that type of stuff or stop buying. And it's just this incredibly complex system that's all tied together. And that's the thing is markets are really, they're organic. They're not a machine. A lot of the time economists or even just your kind of MBA types to kind of categorize people, nothing against people that have MBAs, more power to you, but there is a certain way of thinking that can kind of, I guess, lose the humanity of the market, where you kind of think about it as this predictable thing, because in some ways it can be predictable. In some ways, when you aggregate people together, the averages of large numbers actually do create, in some ways, predictable behavior. But at the end of the day, individuals are pretty difficult to predict, and then you always have that possibility of black swan events that you just didn't know that you didn't know. So markets are really more of an organic thing. It is the sum of everybody's preferences, what you care about, what you're willing to pay is just taken into consideration in aggregate. No one person gets to decide. And even Wizards of the Coast doesn't get to decide. When we're talking about things like VIP boosters, you know what? They set a wholesale price. Doesn't mean that vendors had to buy it. And even if vendors buy it, it doesn't mean that the consumers have to buy it. So they can say the price is whatever they want. If people aren't willing to spend it, transactions aren't going to take place. That number ends up just being a wishful thinking. So that's it. Let me know how you guys like these. Definitely rambling on trying to keep it together for the most part about inflation. But I've got a bunch of different topics like this as far as how they relate to Magic and to collectability in general. I'm kind of leaning toward doing a general finance video at some point too. I've just been talking to some people lately that I've helped out with their finances, and like they're just doing so well over the last couple of years when they've kind of made major life changes based off of our conversations, and they really embrace these ideas that have worked for me, and have kind of worked for most people that end up in a good financial situation. So let me know if that's something you're interested in as well. It might be a little disconnected from Magic. I'll try and have the Magic analogies in there, but that is starting to get into like personal finance and just figuring out how to manage your money effectively to get the type of life that you want. Because I want that for all of you guys. I want everybody to be able to choose the type of life they want and then go out there and make it happen. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, guys. That is all for this one, but don't worry, there is a lot more. You can check out our older videos, and we're always putting out new videos from ELD's Time Vault Games in Bellingham, Massachusetts. If you want to help the channel, of course, you can like, subscribe, share, tap that notification bell so you can know the next time our new videos come out. Thanks for watching.